Greetings, folks. I want to welcome you to Shepherd's Voice magazine here on YouTube. I am recording this on my own this time around, a couple days ahead of the Sabbath. Typically, I have Carrie, my wife, doing the camera work and working all the sound and so forth. And, you know, I probably don't thank her near enough, certainly not publicly, near enough for the help that she gives me getting these videos out to you folks. I sure am blessed to have her. Folks, I want to go into just a fairly maybe basic topic, something today. I don't know as I set out to necessarily write an entire sermon. I've been doing some studying on the story of Cain and Abel. You know, I'm always interested in how extremely long periods of time can elapse in just a few short verses. And the story of Cain and Abel, which, you know, all of Genesis 4 is 26 verses long, and the story of Cain and Abel, before it gets into the whole line of Cain and all that sort of thing, which is a lot more verses. But certainly the story of Cain and Abel is only about 16 verses long. It's not terribly long. So if you want, let's jump over there, and we're going to have a look at Genesis 4. And before we get going, again, thank you to you for allowing us into your home here on the Sabbath, or whenever it is that you happen to be watching this. We want to thank you for your continued support of the videos and the magazine and everything that we try to do to get messages out to you. And as Jim says every week, God willing, these are a blessing to you. But let's look at Genesis 4, and beginning in verse 1. We'll read the first couple of verses there. It says, "The man," and it's talking about Adam, and it says, "was intimate with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have had a male child with the Lord's help." And verse 2, it says, "She also gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel became a shepherd of flocks, but Cain worked the ground." So there's a few interesting things here as we just start to have a look at these verses here in this passage of Scripture. At the end of verse 1, upon giving birth to Cain, we read Eve saying, and this is according to the CSB that I'm using, she says, "I have had a male child with the Lord's help." And this here is an indication that God helped her, or was merciful to her as she gave birth, after God had pronounced that childbirth was going to be a painful thing, after the whole forbidden fruit narrative that, you know, we're not going to read that today. We're going to localize ourselves to pretty much Genesis 4, except for maybe a little bit in maybe a couple other verses in other places. But clearly there was follow-through on God's pronouncement. Genesis 3, in verse 16, God says, "I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children." So the indication is that she likely would have called out for help during this time, and that there was some degree of intervention. Okay, these are the two small things that I'm reading into this, at least. And a point I suppose would be that while God did follow through, okay, you know, the childbirth did become painful. He didn't allow the suffering to become absolutely unbearable, you know, to the point that it just couldn't be lived with. And hence, this mercy that he shows isn't lost on Eve, and she gives God the credit for the fact that God saw her and baby came through. And I bring this up because we're going to see this sort of thing happen again with where I'm going today. But with that, it's neat to note, and I like to note these things. There's between verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis 4 here, the better part of a year at least has gone by. And by the end,
by the end of verse 2, a considerable amount of time has transpired, because the two of them are adults. The first between verse 1 and 2, of course, we have Cain being born, and then Abel being born. So at least the better, like I said, the better part of a year has to go by, and then by the end of that second verse, here they're young adults, at the very least. Abel, this one, he's a shepherd or a worker, a rancher of livestock, and has flocks. And the other, Cain, is a worker of the ground. So, let's continue. Verse 3, Genesis 4. And here's a reference to some time going by. It says, in the course of time, and it may have been a considerable amount, Cain presented some of the land's produce as an offering to the Lord. So notably, his offering is mentioned first, and it's an offering that is the produce of the land. Verse 4, and Abel also presented an offering, some of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, in verse 5, but he did not have regard for Cain and his offering. And it says here that Cain was furious, and he looked despondent. All right, so his countenance has changed. He's angry. Now, there's not a ton said, let alone very much clarity, as to any physical reason or anything of why Cain's offering wasn't given regard by God. And I know there's been a ton taught on it and that sort of thing, but let's just go with what we can glean for right now. Clearly, there was a requirement that an offering be made. All right, God clearly had given some requirement to them that they were to bring some of what they produced in their land, either from an animal or, likely Cain from the ground. So these were adults who were responsible for furnishing these offerings. So what I would, if I was to read something into that, I would look at it as has a lot to do with the people doing the giving, both Cain and Abel. And a distinction is made with regard to the respective offerings, in that more detail is provided about Abel's gift, for sure. And those details are presented positively as it talks about the firstborn of the flock and the fat portions. Okay, so it's brought in a more positive light. And it would appear that Abel put care and thought into what he brought. And I think it would be safe to presume that his attitude was one of doing his part to satisfy the request from his Lord. Okay, again, like I said, I'm going for very simple things that we can glean here. Less, however, is said about Cain's offering beyond the facts that he brought produce from the ground. That made it the distinction from the animal sacrifice that Abel brought. God didn't regard what he brought, and that he became furious. And notably, his countenance was that he looked despondent. He looked sad. He was dejected. Now, again, like I said, there's been a fair amount taught and written about the offerings, and I'm not so concerned about that today. And a lot's been said and taught about the subsequent acceptance and rejection. But as you might expect, I don't know if that's entirely the focus. You know me. I like to suss out the focuses of these scriptures. And honestly, sometimes the really good stuff is at the end of the verse. And this is the case in this particular instance. So let's have another look at verse 5. Genesis 4, verse 5. It says, But he did not have regard for Cain and his offering, and then, notably, Cain was furious and looked despondent. So it's not just his offering that's being rejected or not given regard. It's Cain himself. So he's internalizing this in a very deep way. And this does say something for sure about Cain's mindset and attitude to begin with. All right, in terms of where was he at when it came to actually giving this offering to begin with. And again, it's not a terribly huge leap to think that he was perhaps resentful in some way, perhaps at having to give anything at all. But certainly from his negative standpoint that we see here, it's certainly not a huge leap from that to turning it into a produce of half measure. Maybe he didn't bring the best of what he had. Maybe his attitude wasn't right there. Clearly there was something wrong. That God was not accepting the offering, and he was not giving regard to Cain himself. And I think we'll see here that it's Cain's countenance and his behavior and so far that seems to get God's attention early on. Let's continue in verse 6 of Genesis 4. It says, "Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you furious, and why do you look despondent?'" So he addresses both of these things. He says in verse 7, "If you do what is right, won't you be accepted? But if you don't do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." And this is some interesting turn of phrase here that I want to have a look at here. So let's do just that. Let's have a look at what's happening here. You see, obviously Cain wasn't exactly holding back with how he felt. And I would assume, quite readily, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, that God knew full well why Cain was acting the way he did. I'm sure it wasn't much of a secret to God. So what's happening? Well, it would appear that as though Cain was particularly set off by the whole event. And I think it wasn't just the rejection that clearly he felt from God. This was the whole thing. He was internalizing everything. He saw Abel being given regard, as the CSB puts it. And it would almost appear as though that fact began to overshadow, the reasons that Abel's gift, his offering, was given regard and was accepted, seems to overshadow the reason or reasons why Cain's wasn't. And it's that kind of lack of focus that I think is Cain at the heart of Cain's issue here. You see, his own personal idealism got in the way. You see, he didn't consider how Abel's offering may have been good for God. Maybe it enhanced God. Maybe that's what God wanted. This is how God liked it. This is how he had asked for it. The only thing he saw was Abel's success, let's call it that, success, and how it negatively affected him. In the roundabout, it seems that Cain didn't really consider how the offering was to affect God. Either offering, Cain's or Abel's. He just saw how it affected him. So in that, he neglected God's part in the whole thing. At every turn, it would seem. See, God saw through it, though. He saw through it. And I find it interesting how he interacted with Cain prior to Cain allowing his angle to eventually boil over. I mean, spoiler alert, Cain doesn't handle things very well here. So let's have a look at how God approached him. What did he say? Right away, he says, "Why are you furious? Why do you look despondent?" You see, God recognized that there was something wrong with Cain. He knew there was something wrong with Cain, and he's trying to draw him out. You see, he's trying to have a conversation with him. He's trying to have a conversation with Cain. I find that so compelling. He tries this conversation route before he gives him a warning even. At this juncture, he begins to counsel Cain. He says, if you do what is right, won't you be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. That's verse 7. If you do what is right. See, I think Cain's core attitude is being addressed here. Note how he begins. That is how the Lord, how God begins by showing how the situation could be different. He asks him, if you do, he kind of puts it back on him. If you do what's right, won't you be accepted? God knows that these things tend to kind of answer themselves. So he begins with that, and I'll just note that I've said it a number of times, and I know Jim has said this too, or statements similar to it, how our relationship with the Father has a lot more to do with his reaching down to us than it does with us reaching up to him. And there's a bit of that going on here. And I find it very compelling. You see, God truly wants a relationship with his creation. And even way back here in Genesis, we see examples of this. So then, of course, there is the warning to Cain, if he allows himself to spiral. And I believe we can equate doing what is right with our motivation becoming aligned more closely with the Father's will. I'm sure you would agree with me on that. I'm just going to move myself ahead on my computer here. Apologies for the delay here. Just a sec. There we are. You see, by straying from what we read that Cain was told, and that is that sin is waiting or crouching at the door, and its desire is for you. You see, sin crouching at the door. This gives me the vision of something waiting. Waiting to pounce, a snare, an ambush. Okay, sin is sitting there like that. It's opportunistic, and it can spring upon us if we allow ourselves to be unguarded, or if we allow our vulnerabilities to become left unchecked. And it says here that sin, its desire is for you. This is strong language because, as we've noted, God wants this relationship with us, and he wants to build us up in keeping with his image. He wants more God. This is the upshot of God's whole creation. He's trying to have more of himself. But sin, you see, it desires us as well. God desires to have this relationship and be part of us and us to be part of him. But sin, boy, it desires us as well. And it wants to consume us and to own us. It's part of that whole bondage. It wants to consume us. It wants to take our focus away from how things may affect God to how they only affect us, me, right? This is what we're talking about. It wants to determine our outcome. For that to happen, though, we have to abandon our position of strength, which is our reliance on God, our faith in Jesus Christ. But it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to choose to be that way. We don't have to choose to abandon that. We can choose differently. It's strange that we might think of it that way, but our reliance on the Almighty is the only position of strength or advantage that we have. It's how we rule over it being sin. It's how Cain could have ruled over it as well, but it wasn't to be. So let's continue and see what happens when anger, jealousy, and denial do in fact take over. Genesis 4, verse 8. Now Cain has this conversation with his brother. He gets him to come out with him out to the field. There's a very short amount of sentences here to describe this, but the long and short of it is he says to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were out in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Now, it doesn't say how, but he killed him. He murdered his brother. So when we come into this kind of a spiral of anger and jealousy and denial, it's too much looking inward, negatively looking inward. Clearly, it can lead to a growing list of negativity and dishonesty. These things gain momentum as they spiral out of control in our lives. And what began as a point of vulnerability or perhaps misguided thinking was allowed to morph into deception and murder. This is showing an extreme of where these kinds of things can go. So, not only does Cain deceive his brother into walking directly into his own demise, but then he lies to God. You know, similarly to when God was calling out to Adam and Eve after they had eaten of the fruit. You know, where are you? I'm hiding. Well, Cain does the same sort of thing. In verse 9 it says, then the Lord says to Cain, where is your brother Abel? Now he just flat out lies, right? Now he's really tied up in this. He says, I don't know, he replied. And this is one of the more famous statements in the Bible. He says, am I my brother's keeper? And in the CSB it says, am I my brother's guardian? You see, I think once we begin down the road of deflecting negative aspects of ourselves onto other people, as Cain did here, it becomes easier. It becomes easier to add deception to deception to deception. It's easier to pile on more dishonesty. You see, God knew exactly where Abel was and what had happened. But again, Cain's reaction to God, and is brought into focus here. Then God says, and like I said, he knew what was done, but he's focusing on Cain here now. Then he says, what have you done? What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. In verse 11 he says, so now you're cursed. You're cursed, alienated from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood that you have shed. And he pronounces furtherance to this sentence, and he says, if you work the ground, it'll never again give you its yield. And you will be a restless wanderer of the earth. This angered God. He wasn't happy with how this turned out. You see, Cain was comfortable with his place as a worker of the fields. I would assume that, because this, you have to ask yourself, if that wasn't part of the problem, Cain's comfort, he seemed to have an issue with this. He was an uncomfortable person for all the wrong reasons. But ask yourself this, if it wasn't part of the problem, why would God seemingly hit Cain where it hurts? Because he really did. You see, today we think of punishment in terms of incarceration or imprisonment, that kind of thing, limiting freedom and mobility. But you see, instead of settling the land, Cain is now sentenced to be this restless person, wandering. And the ground was going to fight back at him. It'll fight him in terms of giving up his yield. And this brought on its own kind of prison for Cain. And not only has God rejected Cain's offering here and accepted Abel's, but now even the ground, it says, has alienated you. The very ground that soaked up the blood of Abel will now reject what Cain plants in it. Now, this is tough. And then we see here in the next verse, in 13, how other people were seemingly a risk to Cain as well. And he brings an appeal to God. Finally, now he appeals to God. It's affecting him. It's really hurting him. He's feeling the squeeze now. Verse 13. But Cain answered the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Since you are banishing me today from the face of the earth, and I must hide from your presence and become a restless wanderer of the earth, whoever finds me will kill me." And again, I'll say, note how all of a sudden Cain is keenly aware of the distance that he's put between himself and God. Everything that God had warned Cain about has come true. Sin was crouching at the door. It desired him. And Cain wasn't able to govern it. Sin was waiting for him to allow his anger and his misplaced grievances to provide an opening. And when it did, it drove him to the point of a completely unjust and aggravated murder. He allowed it to determine his outcome, at least in the short term. Note what happens when he does, in fact, though, appeal to God, when he realizes how powerless he is. Verse 15. The Lord replied to him, in that case, in your translation it says, not so. This won't happen. In that case, he says, whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And he placed a mark on Cain so that whoever found him would not kill him. And then Cain went out from the Lord's presence, and he lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Again, we see God didn't relent. He followed through. Cain did, in fact, dwell as a wanderer east of Eden. But did, in his mercy, God, that is, in his mercy, he assuaged Cain's fear of being killed by those who might find him as he sojourned. But I think this probably afforded Cain a fair amount of time to think. Ponder where he was in life. See, God showed and even guaranteed Cain a certain amount of mercy. You have to forgive my cat yowling in the background here. See, while he was put out and he was going to wander, living away from the presence of God, God still made sure that there was protection. This is similar to Eve, and, the childbirth was painful, but with God's help, it was made bearable. And as time went on, God did allow Cain's family to prosper, in that Cain was instrumental in building a city that would be named for his son Enoch. Verse 17, it says, Cain was intimate with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Then Cain became the builder of a city, and he named the city Enoch after his son. And this is, again, kind of a nod to how much time can elapse in a few short verses. Folks, I guess an interesting thing about the story of Cain here is that he did meet with the mercy of God. even under what we might consider the absolute worst of circumstances. I mean, it doesn't get a lot worse than murder inside the family. Fratricide. The sad part, though, is that it took such a long, a long and violent route to get there. Think of it this way, because in his wandering, I'm sure that Cain likely did. If God was willing to show mercy to Cain in light of what he clearly saw as a heinous act, he said Abel's blood cried out from the ground in need of justice. Well, how much more might he have realized had he had taken it to heart when God first approached him regarding a failed attempt at an offering? When he was only furious and looking despondent, as opposed to guilty of spilling innocent blood. If he had only responded to God when he had reached out to him, rather than responding by deflecting whatever it was, shame, guilt, anger, jealousy, onto Abel, and punishing him for his shortfall. Well, if only, I guess, but then we wouldn't have this lesson, would we? And somewhere in there, God willing, there is a lesson for us. Let's not take the long route to the back door of mercy the way Cain did. Especially when God is inviting us through the palace gates. So folks, with that, I'm going to stop there for the day. Again, I want to thank you for joining us today. Subscribe if you haven't, and give us a thumbs up, thumbs down, send us some feedback. We always appreciate it. I want to thank you again for supporting us here at Shepherd's Voice Magazine and making it possible that these videos can go out and we can share these messages with you, which, God willing, are a blessing to you. I'm out of pages. I'm out of time. So with that, I'm going to bid you happy Sabbath, and we'll see you next time on Shepherd's Voice Magazine.